I was on Discord today. I'm talking about the Auspicious Conjunction because I'm wanted to go down the Prussia rabbit hole. I'll do that next stream for sure, but it's like, I'll just tell you, like, I wanted to go down the Prussia rabbit hole, right, for tonight. And I was like, Lenin incarnated the auspicious conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn because Jupiter is the trajectory of the European logos through Plato and philosophy and rationalism and institution building and rational systems and theory and the dimension of consciousness. That's Jupiter, right? And then Saturn is the principle that's associated with fatalism and the unconscious and mystery and fate, and kind of more primordial forces and order. And basically the Saturnian principle manifests itself in the lineage of Genghis Khan, the nomadic revolutions, the revolutionary dynasties, the various Asiatic empires, land empires, religious revolutions like Islam, the rise of Islam, the Ibn Khaldun kind of Asabiya cycle, right? That's the kind of Saturnian principle. Because at the level of consciousness, it's not motivated by any kind of like scientific theory or anything necessarily explicit to consciousness. And conscious activity is not in command. The cities are not in command. You have constant cycles of decadent, sedentary civilizations being rejuvenated by wild nomadic forces, right? And basically, there's a distinct trajectory beginning in ancient Greece where you begin, instead of from below in the nomadic wilderness, you begin from the center. Somehow the center, the city, the polis consolidates itself and immunizes itself from the possibility of nomadic invasion through cultivating science, basically, consciousness, and so on. That's very, very long story short. It's really through usury and slavery, if we're being honest. Slavery, serfdom, whatever, it's all the same. And, these are distinct trajectories and principles of world history. And one, in a way, I wanted to kind of think about how, in a way, one culminates in Prussia. The kind of Jupiter, whatever European principle that begins in ancient Greece, culminates in Prussia, really, right? Not necessarily England, Prussia. And it's from Prussia that we get Hegel and we get Marx. That's why it's important for us to understand Prussia. And Marxism very much has a Prussian context that it comes from. But what's significant about Prussia is that in Asia, communism is this implicit reality that is the unspoken background of all historical, cyclical, dynastic changes. But in Prussia, we have this kind of schizogenesis principle at play in Europe of splintering into various different private forces, private interests, where there is no common universal and rational principle, as Hegel would put it, that unifies a people. And usually the supremacy of a universal and common principle is a consequence in the case of Islam or Genghis Khan, the nomadic Asabiya, creating this egalitarian universal kind of principle, really, that becomes applied to this sedentary civilization. So nomadic peoples cultivate a universal principle that is a restoration of a common order that applies to everyone equally in the tribe. And at a certain level of development, it applies outside of the tribe as well. So some nomadic peoples had a very exclusive notion of order and justice, where it only applies to us. So, for example, the Jews, ancient Jews, But this holds true even for the Mongols in the early stages, who did not see non-Mongols as equals. In the case of Islam, which is a more refined principle of the nomadic cycle, which is why the Mongols actually adopted Islam, some of them at least. The same egalitarian principles that unify the Mongol tribes are applied to sedentary civilizations as well. So this is how the universal principle is understood, is rejuvenated, and exists in the East. In Europe, the universal principle, universal, rational, common principle, as Hegel would put it, of state, is not developed. You have instead the interests of various different private interests with no regard for any kind of common social harmony or cosmic order even. But Prussia is unique because it, as the culmination of this kind of corrupt hereditary feudalism, these various different disparate private interests of these various Junkers and feudal lords, there was an acknowledgement and discovery in some kind of way of the universal. That's very significant. The West's discovery of the universal, I think, comes from Prussia, not France and not England. It comes from Prussia. At least in political practice, comes from Prussia. And the notion of a state that is above the various private interests, although this is not true in practice in Prussia, somehow that gets acknowledged without the nomadic. I was talking before in another stream about how I was fascinated by Thomas Munzer's revolution, how it didn't have this foreign nomadic element intervene. Instead, it had Florian Geyer, who was a professional knight, the Black Company, a professional mercenaries and knights, joined their side. So you have the skilled, cultivated kind of urban civilization from the top down, almost in some sense, artificially approximating or producing what typically throughout history comes from without, from the kind of periphery, right? Like the desert or the steppe or something, right? And this is why Prussia is where we get German idealism. It's really the origins of the German idealism. And it's what happened with the abolition of a state's representation and the creation of a absolute monarchy, a absolute centralized state under Frederick the Great. Even before I forgot his name, in the 17th century, even before Frederick the Great. But this was still an institutional universalism. It was just the universalism of an institutional bureaucracy, not an organic universal principle of society. So, in a way, there's an auspicious conjunction that happens, incarnating in Lenin, where he unifies Marx, culmination of Prussia, of the Western trajectory, with the kind of Scythian masses, the Scythian hordes, right? The Saturnian principle of asabiya and nomadism and cyclical dynastic change. And that is the auspicious conjunction, the alignment of Jupiter and Saturn. That's what it means. It's the alignment not simply of the planetary bodies that's significant. It's the alignment of the principles those bodies represent within astrology or cosmogony, whatever you want to call it. It's the alignment of those principles that since ancient Babylonia through Persia and through the Mughals and so on through Timur, that's what represented the basis of real political authority. Thanks, Dastard. So what I find interesting is how after World War II, the Soviet Union takes one of the centers of Prussia, the most important ones. We know of it now as Kaliningrad, and the Soviet Union officially becomes the heir of Prussia. And on that note, we'll save the juicy stuff for next stream. All right, guys.